Leola forgot one person. I worked many years beside Leola. She was the assistant director for the CRB for many years while I was here. We stole her fair and square from the trial court programs division, and boy, Peter Kiefer never talked to me again, her old boss. Leola is that rare person who has a mix of vision and ability to see how it gets implemented on the ground. And for all the systems change efforts that I've led across the years, I'll tell you that that is a rare quality. Her passion for the CRB, her commitment to the staff, her vision, her integrity. She was my rock when my, as the staff used to call it, Italian personality disorder went kind of out of control. And I know you couldn't possibly imagine that, but it did happen every now and then. Leola is steady, thoughtful, caring. I adore her. Leola, thank you. So, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, we talked about this last year. That law was passed by Congress in 1974 and has been amended since. One of the things that Congress did in their ultimate wisdom was to mandate that each state have 3 citizen review panels, CRPs, not to be confused with CRBs. What most people don't know, but we know, is that that was our effort to try to get citizen review nationwide. And Senator Hatfield introduced that bill in Congress. Given the sausage-making process that is Congress, it turned out saying every state has to have 3 citizen review panels. Their job is to take a look at how the system is functioning, how DHS is discharging their responsibilities in child welfare, provide for public comment, and then issue recommendations for system improvement. For quite a few years, the early years, this work was done internally in DHS. Interesting, given that you have a dual mandate, like we talked about last night, both to review and to advocate for systems change. The CAPTA panels are set up in different ways all around the country, but I think that you are most uniquely positioned to be administering this program, which you have been doing now for the last 3 years. Because as we were talking about, you see thousands of cases, so you really have a bird's eye view of what's going on in the system. So this is the 3rd year, again. The boards, or panels, see, I did it myself. The panels this year are in Lane, Douglas, and Multnomah County. This is Lane's 2nd year doing the panels, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about their work. During the summertime in July, the 3 counties gathered at the Oregon Gardens, which was beautiful, by the way. If you haven't been there, I've never been there. Gathered at the Oregon Gardens and heard from Lois Day, who is the head of child welfare for DHS, as you all know, talking about kind of the agency's priorities, all the agency federal planning processes that were going on, so that they would know kind of what direction the agency was going. I have kind of a bottom line philosophy about systems change, and that is that you really need to be coordinated and on the same page with the stakeholders with whom you are working, because if DHS is going in that direction and you decide you're going that way, who do you think's coming with you? Nobody. So Lois was there to talk to us about the priorities of the agency. After that, the 3 counties met for, gosh, more than a full day to identify the system area of concern they wanted to address in the coming year for the CAPTA panels. Lane County chose older youth in care, narrowed that somewhat to be particularly focused on kids who had run away and kids who were exposed to or at risk of commercial sexual exploitation. Judge Love from Lane County was actively involved in the panel, went to Reno to an event that was hosted by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges on commercial sex trafficking of children. We had attorneys, we had foster parents, we had CASAs, we had quite a few system stakeholders. The Lane County panel went out of their way out of their way. And Lisa, thank you so much. Lisa and Maria, is Maria here? Lisa and Maria, one of our board members from Lane County, scoured the county one side up and the other side down, trying to get feedback from foster kids. So they did a focus group with foster kids. They did a survey of foster kids. Tell you what we found out. You'll be stunned. Children are less likely to run away if they feel connected. Duh. Yes, as the chief said last night. And empowered if they feel like their voices are heard. The kids who did not run away had fewer workers, fewer placements, fewer schools, fewer therapists. So the higher the number of schools, the higher the number of therapists, the higher the number of the workers. I will tell you, when I worked here in Oregon, it was my life's work at which I failed to try to get the agency to change its caseworker assignment model. It never made sense to me that in the best of circumstances, you were going to have 3. So you were going to have an intake worker, you were going to have a foster worker, foster care ongoing worker, you were going to have a permanency planning worker, 4, and you were going to have an adoption worker. What up with that? And what I heard was, oh, they can't possibly know all that stuff. And I said, really, because in Baker County, they have to, because they don't have enough workers that they could get 4 per kid. So research has also shown, and Chief talked about this last night, 2 things came out of the Federal Child and Family Services reviews that have now gone through 2 rounds, and the 3rd round is coming up. 2 things are directly related to reunification: family time, parenting time, and caseworker contact. So, again, said this last night, all about relationships. So having a system that gives you 4 caseworkers just from the get-go just doesn't make any sense, but failed miserably at that. The kids that the panel talked to had some pretty specific ideas, and I'm just giving you a very high-level couple of things about each county. They really thought it was important to have better matching of foster homes. They really didn't know when they were going to move, where they were going, what that foster home was about. They didn't know what the rules were. One of the things that that panel will be recommending is that DHS do kind of a one-pager on each foster home that takes kids, so kids can take a look at it and see what kind of home am I going into, so that kids can see the rules. They said they'd like to have the rules posted so that they know what they are. Because as you saw yesterday in the video in such a powerful way, you know, you unfortunately sometimes show up at a place that you know nothing about with all of your belongings in a trash bag. I'm hoping that doesn't happen anymore, but it certainly used to. Kids were very connected to the independent living program. They're very connected to the Foster Youth Connections program, and said they really need transportation. Foster parents need support to do that. It's really easy for us to say, hey, you know, we really hope you're driving your kids to independent living while you have 7 more at your house. So we talked about expanding opportunities for volunteers to help out in providing that kind of support. The top priority for the panel in Lane County is that there be a local shelter. Can you believe that there is no shelter in Lane County? The kids have to be taken out of county if they need short-term shelter placement. And what was most interesting in the results from the survey is that 70% of the kids who ran said they just needed a time and place to cool off, and then they were able to go back. But if your time and place to cool off is out of the county, not so hot, especially depending on how long it might take you to cool off. So the panel has already written a letter to the Oregon legislature asking them to support a package that DHS has put into their budget for a shelter in Lane County, long overdue. Douglas County. Big lessons learned in Douglas County. And I'm sorry, Lane County, folks, thank you so much for your work. Douglas County, very interesting. They started off talking about placement with relatives, and as they kind of matured in their conversations, they narrowed it down to taking a look at the kids whose permanency goals were another planned permanent living arrangement, the dreaded APLA. First thing they did was pull data. Get this. Are you ready for this? 77 kids in the last 5 years, 350 placements. 77 kids, 350 placements. Now, I got to tell you, this is what I was talking about last night. I am sure when the CRB reviewed those cases, when the court reviewed those cases, for some reason they thought APLA was a good idea. And they were hearing, Johnny moved, Susie moved, Johnny moved, Susie moved. You can't do that. You have to be attacking every one of those APLA cases. So they had 350 placements. 26 of those 77 kids were under the age of 13 with the goal of APLA. And are you ready for this? 5 of them were under the age of 10. 1 of them was 3. And you're like, hello? What is this about? The Assistant Attorney General who works with the branch down there was there for the meeting where we talked about some of these data. And she said, and she's a great person, and she's got a lot of fire in her belly. And she said, oh, you just need to understand that's a placeholder goal. What? A placeholder goal? There's no such thing as a placeholder goal, people. A goal is a goal is a goal. So every single APLA case you're looking at, you need to be asking. Oregon, you're not allowed to say this, but I do it anyway. Oregon flunked the first round of federal reviews because the court was not re-examining every more appropriate permanency plan other than APLA at every hearing and review. So every time you review a case that has APLA as a goal, you need to be asking, what about return to parent? What about adoption? What about guardianship? Things change. Kids change. When I worked for the CRB, and this is a long time ago, I want to say it was in the 90s in Multnomah County, we had a case a day where there were 10 cases that were all long-term foster care. This was back before the ASFA passed, the Adoption and Safe Families Act. 10 cases. And I said, you know what, guys, this is ridiculous. Our whole day is long-term foster care. It's crazy. So let's ask. Let's just do it. Let's ask. What about return to parent? What about adoption? What about guardianship? Do you know that the goal changed in 6 out of the 10 cases? Because things had changed. And foster parents said, well, I didn't think we could adopt because I thought that Johnny was, Johnny had so many issues and we weren't going to be able to get the services we need, but he's doing great 6 years later. So the goal was changed to adoption. Douglas County is doing permanency roundtables now. They've done permanency roundtables on 17 of these APLA kids. Guess what? Permanent homes for 12 of them. You gotta ask. You gotta ask. So they're going to go forward, hopefully, and do more. One of the coolest things about Douglas County, people were so honest and so upfront, and they said, this county, and these aren't their exact words, but pretty close, Walt can vouch, this county's done things the same way for a long time. This is the way we've always done things. It was started by so-and-so and so-and-so, and I won't name any names, Judge Poole and Tom Bernier, but, Judge Poole was a very strong leader in Douglas County, a very strong leader, loved that man, and things were done a certain way. Tom Bernier, very high-powered, powerful attorney, huge advocate, so he and Judge Poole really put together the way the system worked in Douglas County, and they haven't looked at it since. And what they figured out, new judges coming in, so this is really cool, what they figured out is that they, like most people, are victims of money being in certain silos that pay for the things that kids and families don't really need. The money's there, but it really needs to be over here. So what they really want to do is have a convening, reinvigorate their model court team. And if you as CRB volunteers haven't been a part of or don't know about your local model court team, that is a team that should be focused on system reform. And they said they really wanted to have a candid conversation about what the heck they've been doing in Douglas County. And I think in the back of everybody's mind is, how do we have 77 kids with 350 placements? That was pretty stunning. So they really want to sit down and talk about how are we going to do things differently over in our future. And I thought that was super cool. Multnomah County, Douglas County, ably supported by Walt, Lane County by Lisa, and Multnomah County by Dave. They've been working really, really hard. It's been fabulous. Multnomah County also chose relative placement, but they were particularly interested in whether the policies and procedures of DHS had a disproportionate impact on communities of color. So they did a survey, they did focus groups, they did a point-in-time case review. The good news is that we found there were no differences, no race differences in the placement rates. It did not make a difference whether you were a child or family of color and whether or not your kids were placed with relatives. One of the things that we really cared about was the waiver process, and this is one reason that I was a little on the fence, Rakeem, yesterday when we were saying we usually don't ask about why they were turned down, and I totally get the sensitivity to that. I do think, though, that there's got to be a way, and I'll tell you how we can all talk about it at some point, got to be a way that we can get that information in a way that's not intrusive, because there is an option for a non-safety waiver. If you are turned down as a relative placement and it's not a safety issue, you don't have enough bedrooms, whatever, you don't have enough fire, whatever, you can get a non-safety waiver on criminal convictions as well. So if you have past criminal convictions, but they are not person convictions, they are non-safety convictions, a relative can get a waiver and can be certified if that waiver is granted. One thing we found out is that DHS doesn't track any data on who applies for a waiver and who doesn't get it. So how do you know you have some kind of consistent implementation across decision makers if you don't even know who's applying and who's not getting it? That was a little bit scary. 22% of the cases in Multnomah County had no relative search or no relative identified. Now, we didn't know how much was asked, and you saw in that case scenario yesterday, their relatives in Texas, none of them are appropriate. Well, I'm sorry, that's not good enough. You know, whom did you ask? Are there paternal relatives? So we were questioning a little bit such a high number of no relatives identified. It was 9% no relative search done at all, and 13% no relatives identified. Let's see, what else do I want to tell you? Oh, one of the things that came up with the foster parent certifiers in Multnomah County, and this is really interesting. Again, things you really don't hear unless you start asking the questions. One of the things that came up is the extreme difficulty foster parents have when kids are placed with them and their first check doesn't come till the next month because they're having to lay out all the upfront money. Now, I know when I was a caseworker, but this is ancient history, when I was a caseworker, we could get clothing vouchers and we could get some things like that. I don't know if those things are still available, but the panel was pretty concerned about that. So that's a real quick overview of what the 3 counties are working on. There's a lot of frustration. I was just talking to one of our CAPTA panel members from last year yesterday. There's frustration out there that when the CAPTA panel issues its recommendation, they are done. This is not a group that picks it up and runs with it. But at the risk of Leola killing me, but we've been friends for a really long time, just because the CAPTA panel can't follow up doesn't mean the CRB can't follow up. So the chief talked to you last night about the strategic planning process that the Judicial Department has just been through, and you will be doing, as he said, your own strategic planning process in the fall. I think that these CAPTA recommendations are something that should inform that strategic planning process. You may decide there are bigger fish to fry and bigger things to take on, but these CAPTA panel recommendations are based on hard data, a careful review of the issues that the panels considered, So think about that when you're deciding in your strategic planning process which direction the CRB is going to be focused on for the next 5 years. And please do, you know, people hear strategic planning and what's the first thing you do? Bleh. I mean, nobody likes strategic planning. I love it. I am completely invigorated by strategic planning because it is truly setting your direction for the next 5 years. So keep in mind that it's happening in the fall. Hound your field managers until they don't want to hear from you anymore about how your input gets brought to that table. So that's our CAPTA story. Thank you to the 3 counties. Thank you to the staff. You've done a great job.
Plans for CAPTA for next year are going to be a little different. I think we're going to try to stick with the same 3 counties again, but instead of Nancy being the facilitator coordinating the CAPTA work amongst the 3 counties, Lisa Romano is going to be that person. So we look forward to working more with her at that. Next up, I'm honored that we have Laura Porter with us today. Laura Porter is the co-founder of ACE International. She's worked with Dr. Robert Anda to develop and disseminate educational tools and products about empowering and improving the health and well-being of communities. She serves as the director of the ACE Partnership for Comprehensive Health Education Foundation, and she does a lot of data analysis around the adverse childhood experiences and is really working on using data and systemic improvements to change how communities work with and deal with children and families. She's developed a model for improving capacity of communities, and that has delivered some stunning results. She's seen reductions in 7 major social problems and ACE scores among participants in that model. So, Laura, thank you for being here. Thank you.
Thanks, Leola. And thank you so much for welcoming me. I'm so happy to be here. You're not far away. I live in the state of Washington, so it's pretty great to just bop on down to Salem and see all of you. As they're setting up my slides, thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about a cluster of science that we've nicknamed NEAR. So it's neuroscience, epigenetics, adverse childhood experience, and resilience, NEAR. And every time I talk about adverse childhood experience and this bundle of NEAR science, people want me to talk about resilience first, middle, and last. They really want to focus on resilience, and I totally get that. But over the years, after doing thousands and thousands of presentations, I've started to wonder if resilience was enough. Because resilience means doing well in the face of great adversity. And if we take a sort of intergenerational view, don't we want more than that? Don't we want everyone prospering with sustained and continuous and steady and strong, growing into well? We don't want everyone to have to face huge adversity and then do well, right? And so I want to open today by telling you a little story about flourishing. So I have a daughter, her name is Vida, and she lives in Austria. She teaches English in Austria. And one of the great things about having a child overseas is that you have a free place to stay. So I got to go and visit my daughter winter before last. And as I was going to come, she was telling her teacher friends, my mom's coming for the holidays. And one of her teacher friends said, your mom can't come here for the holidays without coming to our house in southern Italy for Christmas Eve, Christmas, and the day after Christmas. And so our arms were really twisted hard, but we got on a train, and then we got on a plane, and we arrived in southern Italy in this amazing area near the town of Bari. And it's down in the heel of the boot in the very southern part of Italy. Absolutely exquisitely gorgeous. And as we were traveling in the car from the airport to home, we watched them talk in Italian. And my daughter's friend speaks English fluently, and so that's how they know each other. She teaches English. My daughter also teaches English. And but they were talking, the family was talking in Italian, and they would talk, and then all of a sudden they'd say, Ariana! And all the hands would fly, including the hands that were normally on the wheels. And we were heading to this home with grandma and grandpa, a great aunt and uncle, moms and dads and cousins, and the first grandchild, 15-month-old Ariana. And so as we arrived at the home, they were just like, Ariana, Ariana! And we ran into the house, and everyone, including the grandma and grandpa, sat down on the ground to play with Ariana. And we played for a while, and then the evening went on, and we got this amazing view of a family that, with this fluidity, was shifting what was happening so that every member of the family had that same kind of joy around them that Ariana had around her. And we would get up in the morning, and they would give us a tiny coffee and a biscotti, and then they would swoop us into a car and travel around so we could see their incredibly beautiful part of Italy. And while we were gone, every other member of the family would be cooking and setting up the house for the evening meal, which was 6 to 9 hours of course after course after course of absolutely exquisite food. And when we would get home, the living room had been transformed into the dining area, and it would have a long table, long enough for 25 to 28, depending on who was coming and going in the moment, people. But the folks would still be cooking away, getting ready for the evening meal, and Ariana would start to do this. 1 foot up, and 1 foot up, and 1 foot up. And one of her uncles would say, everyone, Ariana wants to dance. And they would fly out of the kitchen into the living room, move the already set up tables aside, and all stand in a circle going 1 foot up and 1 foot, and laughing. And if Ariana, 15 months, right, she could put a foot a little too high and land on her bum, and her grandpa would slide like he's sliding into home plate and scoop her up and rock her. Now, this is not a grandpa that knows that rocking soothes the amygdala and helps us recalibrate our emotional response. He's rocking because we've always rocked as human beings through centuries and centuries, right? Through millennia, really. And we would sit at the evening meal, and my daughter and I both know a lot about child development and child psychology, and we adore children. And so we'd be sitting along eating, and there'd be another course that would come out, and another course that would come out, and 10:30 at night, Ariana would get a little bit on the edge. And my daughter leaned over the first time and said, Ariana's going to have to go to bed pretty soon. And oh yeah, for sure, she's going to have to go to bed pretty soon. No, Ariana stayed up with the family, and every time she got a little bit cranky, one of her uncles would jump out of his chair. They jump all the time. They jump out of his chair and say, everyone, Ariana needs more pasta. And they would run into the kitchen and get these giant plates of pasta. And Ariana would happily eat her pasta and get happy again. And Ariana stayed with the family celebration until we were all ready to go to bed at about 2 in the morning, perfectly happy and a part of the celebration. And it was kind of amazing. The first full night we were there, we were lying, we stayed in one of the adult children's rooms that they had grown up in. So there were the 2 single beds on opposite walls of the room. And so my daughter and I were lying there, and my daughter said, Mom, how are you doing? And I said, I think I'm a little in shock. And she said, why, Mom? I said, they're a functional family. And I think one of the hard things is that lots of people maybe have never seen a family that really can, with genuine joy, grow into well together. And that's one of the challenges of being family today, is that we haven't all seen it, and we don't all know in a physiological sense how to experience that. So in my work, I work quite a bit with rock star neuroscientists, one of whom is Dr. Martin Teicher, who is in charge of biopsychiatry and neurobiology research at McLean Hospital. He teaches medicine and psychiatry at Harvard University. He's one of a few neuroscientists that study how maltreatment affects brain development at different ages and stages. And Dr. Teicher came to Washington to teach lay audiences for 9 consecutive years. And so we got to have the amazing privilege of learning from him, but we also got past the point where we didn't understand a single word he said, because neuroscientists use these gigantic words, and you kind of have to let them flood across you for a while before they start sinking in and having a lot of meaning. So I'm going to give you a simpler version of Dr. Teicher, Dr. Richard DeBellis, Dr. Bruce Perry, and other amazing rock star neuroscientists, a simpler version of the lessons that they teach. But I can tell you that Dr. Teicher has reviewed every point that I'm going to make, and has assured me that I've simplified, but I haven't simplified so far that this information is wrong. So neuroscientists teach us that human beings, when we're children and growing up, we're actually made to be in distress, severe distress, only about 20 minutes at a time. Our fight, flight, freeze response comes up when we feel that there's danger, something's life-threatening, and that floods our bodies and our brains with chemicals that help us respond to stressful situations well. But human beings are one of the species on Earth that needs a long, long time of protection. And so we're made to be in distress about 20 minutes at a time with an adult around who can create safety first and then can help us re-regulate. Children actually pattern their breathing, even can slow their heartbeat some. They're patterning their response to stress after the adults around them. And if we're in that kind of positive stress where we have stressors, but an adult that then creates safety and helps us re-regulate ourselves back down to a calm state where we can think things through, that actually creates some amazing skills, not only cognitive skills, but also biological skills. The skill to weather a stressful time and be able to re-regulate oneself and calm back down. But not everyone is raised in a world like Ariana. Some people are raised in a world that's pretty dangerous. And by danger, I mean episodic, frightening events that feel like they're threatening one, and you never know when the next danger might come from around the corner, or continuous bouts of danger that are happen more than 20 minutes and are affecting and flooding our bodies with cortisol and neurotransmitters that help us to react to stress. Unfortunately, that flooding of those chemicals can be toxic to developing brain cells. And they can actually change the functioning and the mass of brain regions as we're growing up in that kind of dangerous environment. And people who grow up with a lot of danger will develop pretty typical characteristics. They might be more hypervigilant. They might be more hyper-responsive, very quick to anger, very slow to soothe. They might be very mission-focused and have a hard time generating a lot of alternatives or seeing a lot of opportunities around them. And they might be less relationship-oriented. They might be quicker to act before you talk things through and take what they need before somebody else is going to get it before you. These actually are adaptations that help the species survive. They're not maladaptations. When I was in college, I was taught these were maladaptations, but neuroscientists have broad agreement now. In fact, there's a National Institutes of Health literature review asking the question of adaptation versus maladaptation, looking at literature from all over the world, and there's broad agreement that these are adaptations that help the species to survive if, in fact, we need to grow up and then live in that kind of dangerous environment for our whole lives. And some people grow up in a really safe environment, and they too will develop pretty typical characteristics. They'll be much more relationship-oriented. They'll think you can talk things through long after you should have gotten up and left the room. They might be distracted by thinking of all the choices and options around them and have a difficult time staying mission-focused. And they might have a tendency not to take what they need, but instead to wait and watch and see what will be there, right? And maybe not get their needs fully met. And both of these tracks, the danger track and the safe track, we are adapting to the world we're anticipating that we'll be living with. And that adaptation isn't psychological, it's biological. We're actually our brain function, our brain mass, and our physiological responses to stress are changed by that adaptation. And Dr. Teicher taught us that it's not really which track you grow up on that can be a challenge. It's more the dissonance between who you became biologically and what society expects of you. So if you grew up on the top track and you're expected to sit perfectly still for an hour and a half and listen to a keynote speaker, for example, and there's a loud noise or something that seems frightening in the room, you're expected to sit perfectly still and keep your breathing calm when your body actually won't do that. And so therein lies the friction that we get when we have people that grow up in a dangerous world, adapt to a dangerous world, and then our expectations are that they can navigate daily life in the same way society expects a person that grew up on the safe track. But those characteristics from that top track are really actually pretty useful. Where in society is a good match for somebody that's hyper-responsive, hyper-vigilant, very quick to act, doesn't need to think things through before they respond? I've never had someone say that. It's so fascinating. Where else? Sports, absolutely. Music, Firemen, our emergency response, yes. And interestingly enough, I did a longer exercise on this very point with a group about a year ago, and what came up from the group was, well, there are heroes for the most part. So you either respond biologically in a very normal way to toxic stress, and you get lucky enough to be matched into a role where you're a hero, and you have amazing protection around you for those characteristics, or how do we typically work with people how does society typically respond to kids, for example, who are hypervigilant, hyperreactive, have difficulty soothing themselves? We medicate. What else do we do? Separate, incarcerate. Right. One of my colleagues calls it the reject and eject policy. And those policies came from a time where we thought this was maladaptation, right? This is new science. We didn't understand it when we developed the norms in the major systems that are now helping kids and families as they grow up. And Dr. Catherine McLaughlin, who is now at the University of Washington, she was at Duke, talks about and researches, she's a neuroscientist who researches the difference between the brain development response to neglect as compared with active danger of abuse. And she developed this simple way of describing that we have situations that are low deprivation and we have situations that are high deprivation, where people don't have exposure to a full array of language, they don't have love and support, they don't have a variety of experience, all of these things that are necessary for healthy brain development, for creating all the synaptic linkages across the brain regions. Or we can have low threat or high threat. And if we look at that situation that kids grow up in, the most complex kinds of exposures are the ones where we have both high deprivation and high threat. And I think that's important to note because kids in foster care very often have had that combination, and unfortunately, according to a study that was conducted in 2007, about 20% of kids at that time who were placed in kinship care or non-kinship care continued to have high deprivation and high threat environments to live in. So our systems aren't yet tooling, giving the skills and knowledgeability to adults to really work effectively with people who've adapted to toxic environments in their earliest years, and so they have a normal response to toxic stress. It's not that we have people that don't care, it's that we have people that don't know yet because the science is new. And so that's one of the reasons that we talk about it. Now, neglect has a very different kind of effect on brain development than abuse, partly because our brains need experience, a variety of experience and exposures, in order to connect up all those the fibers in the brain that help the messaging system across the brain's regions and systems. And when we don't get the experience we need, then we get essentially the brain's connecting hijacked by that neglect. Or if we already had connections and we experience neglect a little later in childhood, we can have the process in the brain called pruning be very dramatically affected. Now, pruning, you've probably seen the slides that show that the brain develops quite a bit of its mass early in the first 3 or 3.5 years of life. And then we continue to develop the connections among that mass all the way until prepuberty and then into adolescence, when the brain actually chooses what to strengthen based on experience. So they called it pruning because neuroscientists used to think that the linkages among cells were actually pruned, cut off. But now they think of it more like, I live in the woods, so I think of it like a path through the woods, that if you use it regularly, all that underbrush stays clear, and there's a clear path from here to there. But if you stop using it, that path is still there, but it's kind of hard to find. And so now neuroscientists are saying pruning is more like that, where the used pathways in the brain become strong and easy to access, and the less used pathways become weaker and harder to access. And that's one of the explanations for why people who have strokes can recapture some of the pathways they had developed when they were children, and through therapy they can develop alternative pathways to get back their functioning. So neuroscientists aren't thinking that we see that recovery because whole new connections from the ground up are being formed, so much as that there were pathways already in existence from childhood experience that we reclaimed and recovered during the stroke recovery process. So it's very important that children have a variety of experiences, especially experiences that help to build the strong and resilient pathways in their brains. So there are 3 factors that really determine outcomes, according to the neuroscientists that study the effect of maltreatment on brain development. One is gender. Girls respond differently at different ages and stages. The second is the kind of experience. Our brains actually respond specifically to a type of experience in order to adapt, so that if we have to have that type of experience for our whole lives, we won't be overwhelmed by it. So if we've had the kind of abuse where there's a lot of auditory bombardment, our auditory processing and meaning-making systems might have less robustness, so that we're not picking up every single auditory danger signal, so that we can actually function in our lives. So it's actually a miraculous process of adaptation. And the third factor is age. And the reason the age that someone experiences toxic stress is important is that brains develop sequentially. So when you're first born, you don't need to be able to take the math exam to graduate from high school or college. You have to be able to what? When you're first born, breathe, eat, cry, swallow. You have to regulate your sleep-wake states some, although mom and dad or whoever is going to help you some with that, right? You have to be able to, most children can recognize a face or the smell of the primary caregiver if they can't see the face, and they can recognize the shape of a breast. So they have to be able to know who will protect them and get nurturing from them. And so as neuroscientists have studied this ages and stages, what they found is that from that first spark of life, when the first cells are dividing into 2 and then 4 and then 16, etc., we experience is already affecting the development of all those cells. And in the first few years of life, the part of the brain that's very sensitive to toxic stress is in the limbic system, our fight, flight, freeze response system. And that makes sense, right? We've got to get our response to danger formed before we have to think through how to take that math test. So our bodies have this miraculous unfolding of the skills that we need in order to do well. So toxic stress during the earliest years has a profound effect on the amygdala and the hippocampus. These are two regions inside of the limbic system, and they operate together. So the hippocampus is known for its role in learning and memory, and the amygdala is known for its role signaling that the body should put out all of those stress response chemicals so that we can, without using our frontal cortex, we can respond physiologically to stress immediately when it occurs. So the amygdala ramps our body up and the hippocampus helps us calm back down. And you've probably read that our learning and memory is most strong when we've had the learning and period of time in an emotionally charged situation or in a strong relational environment, because we've got this learning memory function inside of the region of the brain that's helping us remember what we have to know in order to survive. It also helps us to remember other things as well. So everyone knows now, because we've done such a great job talking about toxic stress during the earliest years, but the earliest years aren't the only sensitive developmental period for brain development. Actually, there are a few other periods where brain regions are particularly sensitive to experience and are shaped by experience. So one is all the way from early all the way through middle childhood, which is about 7 to 9 or 7 to 10. And it's the corpus callosum that is very sensitive to experience. And the corpus callosum is the superhighway that connects the right, left side of the brain. And it allows us to do very complex thinking, including integration of math and language, including our creative and analytical self. Some scientists are now talking about our new kinds of experiences then are integrated into what we do automatically and what we know well, and those pathways for excellence in our lives. And when the corpus callosum is affected by toxic stress during childhood, we see these kinds of functions impacted: language, math, etc. And what's interesting to me about this part of the brain is that there's a difference in gender affecting this part of the brain. For boys, the biggest impact to the corpus callosum is through neglect in the infant and toddler years. But for girls, it's sexual abuse ages around 7 to 9 or 10. So when I am not a neuroscientist, so now I'm going to say a sentence that Marty did not say I could say or not, because sometimes I just go out on a limb a little bit. But when I look at our patterns of our girls having difficulty in math starting in middle school and high school, I have to wonder if it's partly a reflection of how well we as a society are protecting our girls from sexual abuse at ages 7, 8, 9, 10. These are ages when, all of you know, girls become much more vulnerable in the majority culture to be abused. And we know that that abuse would have effects on the ability to integrate math and language, on the ability to integrate these critical components for engineering, etc. So when I'm talking to business audiences, I talk a little bit about if you want enough engineers for your corporate environment, then we will protect children all the way through at least the middle years, because we can't actually have enough engineers unless protection takes place. The next time I want to mention is middle childhood, and a brain region that's very sensitive to toxic stress in that 7 to 10-year-old time is the right temporal gyrus. And I don't want to talk too much about this region of the brain, except to say that this is the region of the brain that helps us with spoken language, but also helps us to retain moderation in the degree to which we experience despair and depression. And when the right temporal gyrus is affected, it can set up for lifetime a risk for suicidal thoughts and ideation, suicide attempts, and a sense that life just isn't worth it. It's too hard. And Dr. Teicher's most recent research has been about peer bullying. So for years and years, all of his publications were about maltreatment, and now he's begun to study more about peer bullying. And what he found is that peer bullying during this period of time, 7 to 10, has the same magnitude of impact on the right temporal gyrus as emotional and verbal abuse in the home. So when we as a society become aware that bullying is happening among children, we should see that as a life-threatening act. Just like when we see a child run into the street after a ball, no sane adult would just let them do that in front of a car, right? We would run after them, we would get them out of the danger. That is true for peer bullying. Peer bullying can set up a lifelong challenge with thinking about suicide, with suicide attempts, and difficulty with relationships around language and connection. So the next sensitive developmental period is just pre-puberty. And during the pre-puberty period of time, the cerebellar vermis is sensitive to toxic stress. And the vermis is known as the seat of mental health. When the vermis is affected by toxic stress, we see connections to every known diagnosable mental illness. And so we're seeing in that pre-puberty time an incredibly critical time for protecting children and youth and making sure their experiences are varied and rich. And that vermis is important also because it's one of the brain regions where we're born with these granular baby cells that are pre-programmed to blossom at puberty. Pre-programmed to blossom. But there's a delay in that blossoming when the vermis is affected. So we might see a 9 to 13-year delay between when toxic stress occurs and when we see the kinds of symptoms that create a diagnosable mental illness. And that's one of the reasons we see the onset of mental illness early in adulthood and not right when the toxic stress is occurring for the child. And last, the cortex. And our frontal cortex is developing throughout that entire period, is sensitive throughout that entire period, is connected to all of the other brain regions, and helps us put all of the strengths of our brain together and helps us think through situations. And that's critical, and it's good news, because the cortex continues to help us develop something called executive function all the way into our late 20s, some people even say into the early 30s. It continues to be a sensitive developmental period for the cortex and its connections to every other part of the brain. And executive function is our ability to set a goal and take directed action toward that goal. It requires really complex thinking. And the good news is, for these families you're working with, and many of the foster families and birth families, we still have adults in the sensitive developmental period. So we have this opportunity where we have children that are in sensitive developmental periods for critical brain development, and we have adults that continue to have tremendous brain plasticity to be developing the skills, knowledge, self-regulation, and other abilities they need to become better parents. So I've talked a little bit about neuroscience, and I promised you neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and resilience. So I'm just going to say a couple things about epigenetics, because I really want to get you to sort of the meat of the matter in terms of not only how does toxic stress affect us, but what are the things we can do to make a big difference for kids and families that have experienced it. So there's a whole new field in genetics. You may be reading about it because it's starting to come into the popular press a little bit. When I was in college, I was taught that as soon as we cracked the genetic code, we would have all the knowledge we would need to know why people get ill and whether we have blonde hair or brown hair and whether we have light skin or dark skin, and even personality type we predicted we would be able to see through genetics. But as we started to fully understand the genetic code, scientists discovered that there's actually a whole nother layer to genetics, the epi layer. So genetics means origin or source, and epi means on top of. And there's a chemical process that is shaped by experience that actually determines how our genes are expressed. So you may have known families where there was a genetic predisposition to a particular problem, but only one person got that problem. Now epigeneticists are saying, well, experience has a big impact on how our genes are expressed. And there's two chemical processes. I won't go into detail on them right now because of time, but there are two processes that allow gene expression to either switch on so that the cell can actually read the code in the gene, or to switch off or silence the reading of that code, or to change the reading of the code somewhat. So we have three different mechanisms by which our genes can be expressed differently in life. And one of those mechanisms, scientists are now quite sure that the genetic expression change is heritable. It is passed to the next generation. So I'll give you an example of this. One study, they took lab rats, and these lab rats had lived their whole lives in the lab, and they were programmed through behaviorist kinds of strategies to become terrified of cherry blossoms. And when you would put cherry blossoms into the enclosure of the adult rats, they would all run to the corner, climb on top of each other in a big bundle, and shake out of absolute terror. And you take the cherry blossoms out of the enclosure, and the rats would be just fine and go back to their regular lives, terrified of cherry blossoms. They took the cherry blossoms away from the environment. The rats had rat pups. The rat pups grew up, and they had no exposure to cherry blossoms at any time during in utero or all the way through their lives. And then they put those baby rats grown to adults into their own environment, and they introduced cherry blossoms. And what do you think those rats did? They ran to the corner, they huddled on top of each other and shook in terror of the cherry blossoms. So why would it be useful to the species for us to be afraid of cherry blossoms when we've never even seen them before? Why would it be useful to the species for us to have a key learning cross between one generation to the next without having to actually experience ourselves in the child generation the problem? Survival, absolutely. So epigenetics is a second way that we are adapting and passing our adaptations on to the next generation, and gives us some clues as to the power of historic trauma in the lives of people, where we see whole population groups who have challenges with health and self-regulation, etc., because of the historic trauma that they've experienced. In some cases, that still goes on today. But even if it weren't still going on today, the genetic expression would have been shaped by that past experience. So epigenetics is beginning to tell us about how we pass from generation to generation these proclivities that affect our society as a whole. What I think is exciting about that, and epigeneticists are just beginning to write about it. I haven't read a full study yet, and if you find one, please email me. My email's at the end of this talk. But I haven't seen one yet where they've actually studied if you teach nurturing behavior, does that shift the epigenetic expression so that nurturing behavior is then easier for the next generation. But epigeneticists are beginning to make sentences at the end of their articles where they're talking about next steps in the research of saying they think that's probably true. That nurturing behavior, when a child generation experiences it, probably changes the epigenetic expression and can be passed on, heritable to the next generation. So I say we should fake it if we have to and create those kind of environments that Ariana had. Even if we've never seen it, we can support each other to do the best we can to approximate it for a generation so that we're passing on the ease in nurturing children for the future. And the last thing I want to say about this neuroscience epigenetics is that we all actually experience reality differently from each other. Moment by moment, we're actually experiencing this room differently from each other. The heat, the light, the energy in the room. And that's because, one of probably many reasons, is because there's a switching or a filtering mechanism that engages the brainstem and the limbic system, our fight, flight, freeze response system. And our sensory information is coming in, it comes through that brainstem, hits the limbic system, and there's a filtering that happens in a fraction of a millisecond. Information is either switched in so that we can think it through and use it, or filtered out in favor of survival. And so we each are experiencing reality differently. And along the way, I'll mention a few things we can do to accommodate, right? Because we can't always change the experience someone has already had in their life. So how do we accommodate to make more space for everyone to be growing into well? And one of the ways is to create safe enough environments where we can actually ask, how did you experience the last 30 minutes? And have enough spaciousness and safety in the environment that a person could actually answer the question and say how they experienced the last 30 minutes. I've had people tell me that they've never been asked and that there's no one that they can tell the truth of their life experience to. Think how lonely that is. It would be very hard if you have a different filtering system and thereby a different perception of the world around you to feel like everything you perceive should be a secret. It's not okay. You see how shame gets built into our just not having the habit of creating enough safety to ask and listen and affirm. Thank you so much for telling me how you just experienced that last 30 minutes. Let's think together about how we can create a more safe environment so that you can navigate this environment and contribute your gifts to what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to talk next about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, but before I do that, I want to tell you a story, because the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experience, ACE, the ACE study, how many of you know the ACE study? Probably quite a few in Oregon. Yeah, about maybe a third of you. The ACE study is the largest public health discovery of our time. And I found for years when I was talking about the ACE study that that was a really hard sentence for all of us to kind of get all the way into our gut. The ACE study is the largest public health discovery of our time. So I am going to tell you the story of another public health discovery that was very, very large and changed the face of the public's health. And that is a story that happened in the 1800s, from 1800 through the 1850s. That's the story of waves of cholera sweeping across Europe and the British Isles and killing tens of thousands of people each time a wave would come through a village or a city. And imagine that you're living in London, and this next wave of cholera is coming through, and you begin to see people you know and care about who have families that wake up in the morning and everyone is alive, and by nightfall, half of the members of the family have died. And you don't know what this disease is, but there's a common belief. There's a belief that the population generally holds. Let me just say that there were a number of beliefs at that time. Some people believed that only people with bad faith, bad belief, were the ones who were dying. There were some people that believed that only people from certain places were the ones that were dying. There were lots of kind of we know, but the predominant belief was miasma. Miasma is the smell in the air. And so you know those old-fashioned movies where they have the big iron grates with the incense? They were changing the smell in the air because they were quite sure the smell in the air was killing people. So that would be logical, wouldn't it? But you're living in the 1840s and 50s, and you know a good friend of yours is Dr. John Snow. And John Snow says, you know, I just can't line up all the facts, because people aren't dying of lung symptoms, they're dying of intestinal symptoms. So it can't be smell in the air, there has to be something else going on. And Dr. Snow suspended the common belief or the mental model of the day and continued to notice and ask. And one of the ways he noticed in the mid-1850s was to begin to put an X on the map every time someone died in the next big cholera wave that came through. And unfortunately, it didn't take very long. Cholera is very deadly. Before, it was a pretty clear pattern. There were X's all around, clustered around one water pump, the Broad Street pump. So you know Dr. John Snow, you trust him, you know he's been working on this, he runs to your house, he's got the map, he knocks on the door, you open the door, and he says, I've got it, it's the water. What do you do? Louder? You find a different place to get the water. You stop drinking that water and get different water, absolutely. And you might do one more thing, you'd tell your neighbor. And those two things, you tell everyone and you act within your own sphere of influence, right? I can change where I get my water. I'm going to make the change I can do in my sphere of influence. That's what we do to save lives in a major public health discovery. We tell everyone and we act in our own sphere of influence. It would be decades before they truly understood that it was water from one river and not another. It would be decades before the germ theory was solid enough for them to really understand what it was that was carried in the water that would cause the death. It would be over 100 years before nations had clean water laws. We can't afford in a public health discovery to be waiting for the laws to be in place. Too many lives go by as we're doing that. But if we take action in our own sphere of influence and we tell everyone so they do too, we get this amazing layering effect that's very, very powerful for change. Dr. Snow, for example, could order that the handle be taken off the pump. So while I might just stop drinking the water, he might have the authority to take the handle off the pump. I save lives immediately. He saves everyone's lives. Maybe took a few weeks, right, before he could take the handle off the pump. So because we act in our own sphere and we attend to that sphere, we can create this really powerful layering of action with the new body of science we have today. So the ACE study. The ACE study was developed by two amazing scientists who did the same thing that Dr. John Snow did. They had been doing work. Dr. Vince Folletti was in charge of preventive medicine at Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. Dr. Robert Anda was a senior scientist at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Both of them were in very different situations where they noticed that they couldn't line all the facts up. And the traditional explanations for risk and disease didn't match the facts. So Dr. Folletti in Kaiser Permanente, he was noticing that people very successful with his prevention programs were the most likely to fall back and in fact have even worse health after they had had some time after the prevention program finished. So that was really different than what he thought would happen. And he did something that's truly remarkable. He sat down with individuals and listened. He asked, how has your life affected you? What were you feeling at the end of this program? How did your life unfold? And he began to hear a pattern of adversity during childhood. And Dr. Anda, who was at the Centers for Disease Control, Rob had won large awards for helping to develop the surveillance system for health in our country. And he was on the team that developed the heart disease prevention strategy for our nation. But he couldn't line up all the facts because at that time, prevention research was all about the top three rungs of this pyramid. We were identifying risks. We could try to reduce risk in order to reduce disease, in order to reduce early death, right? But risk is not random in the population. So Dr. Anda said, something's got to be driving the risk. So when Dr. Anna and Dr. Folletti got together and looked at the facts as they were unfolding in those two very different arenas, they said, perhaps adversity during childhood is disrupting or changing neurodevelopment, which is leading to risk. So they created the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, the largest epidemiological study of its kind in the world at that time. Over 17,000 participants using the very highest scientific rigor, a stunningly impressive study which is changing the face of how we understand life course, how life unfolds, and the influence of adversity during childhood. Now, when the ACE study was first generated, none of the neuroscience that I opened with, those studies hadn't been done yet. This was brand new thinking that now we see the late 80s. The first publication started in the early 90s. So they considered 10 kinds of experiences. They considered 5 kinds of household dysfunction that they thought would probably create high levels of stress, either episodic or long duration stress among children. And they considered 3 kinds of abuse and 2 kinds of neglect. So the household functioning, they looked at whether you grew up with a mentally ill, depressed, or suicidal person in your home, whether you had a drug-addicted or alcoholic family member while you were growing up, parental discord, and they used indicators of divorce, separation, and abandonment, but they were looking at discord. Witnessing violence. In the original study, it's witnessing violence against one's mother. In the state's data, it's witnessing violence against any parent in the household. And then incarceration of a family member. And their idea around incarceration was there was illegal behavior and all the stresses surrounding that and possibly strife in the household around that, and then the loss of a parent. And that combination probably creates the kind of stress loads that we talked about in the neuroscience section. And one of the first things that they noticed as the data started coming back in was that ACEs are highly interrelated. At that time, child abuse was studied entirely separately from child neglect, for example. There was a whole body of literature on child sexual abuse separate from the body of literature on child physical abuse. A whole separate body of literature on having an incarcerated parent. But what they noticed was among people with one kind of adverse childhood experience, 87% had more than one. So it didn't make sense to them that we were studying these things one by one by one, because they don't actually occur that way. ACEs come in clusters in most people's lives that have adverse childhood experience. And so they created a simple way to look at the accumulation of adversity in a child's life while they're developing, and that's the ACE score. So they took these 10 kinds of experiences, and they said if you had any one of these kind of experience, your ACE score would be 1. If you had all 10 kinds of experience, your ACE score would be 10. And they did look at frequency and severity, but the data told them that more important for lifelong outcomes is how the pileup of these different kinds of experiences occur during development. ACEs are extremely common. This is Oregon data. We flash forward from the original ACE study. Now we have, I believe it's 25 states now that have added ACE questions to their telephone household survey of adults. And so we now have prevalence data about ACEs in the adult population in those states. Oregon is one of those states. And we see ACE prevalence pretty darn close to the same as the original study. About 64%, over 2/3 of adults have at least one ACE in Oregon, and 28% have 3 or more. That's just about exactly the same as in Washington. So we Northwesterners have ACE scores about the same prevalence as the original study. Another thing that they noticed was that the relationship between ACE score and health outcomes had this strong graded or dose-response relationship. And this is a classic relationship that you look for in epidemiology to think about, are ACEs causing these problems, or is something causing both the ACEs and the problem? And so there's a There's a gold standard in epidemiology. There are 9 tests for inferring cause. The ACE study meets all 9, but the dose-response relationship creates the easiest visual way to show you how powerful ACEs are in the population. And you all know dose response. If you put more gas or electricity in your car, you can go more miles. That's dose response. In this case, the higher the ACE score, the higher the percentage in the population with a challenge or problem. So let me show you just briefly some of those challenges and problems that are highly driven by ACEs in the population. A big portion of risk for disease is attributable to ACEs. And I've got a couple of charts and graphs here just to show you. So all of these are laid out the same. Along the bottom are the ACE scores from 0 at the left to higher ACE scores, 6, 7, or 8 on the right. And you can see the stair-stepped pattern. The higher the ACE score, the higher the percentage in the population, and the top chart that was currently smoking in 2009. So the vertical axis is the percentage of the population that was smoking. Now, if among the population, this particular slide is Washington data. So in 2009, Washington had invested millions and millions and millions and millions and millions and millions, and I could go on, millions and millions of dollars in helping people quit smoking and helping to prevent people from starting smoking. We won one of the largest tobacco settlements in the nation, and we focused those dollars to help save lives through stopping smoking in Washington. About 10% of the adult population was still smoking in 2009 if they had 0 ACEs, but 28% of the people with high ACE scores were still smoking in 2009 after that huge investment. Now, I already mentioned that toxic stress during sensitive developmental periods can lead to more hypervigilance, more anxiety, more difficulty with focusing in ways that society expects you to, etc. So why would people still be using tobacco in 2009 if they had very high ACE score? Because nicotine actually helps. Nicotine has, if you look up beneficial value of nicotine, you'll see that whole list. It reduces anxiety, it helps have more appropriate focus, it helps people not feel so jittery, it helps people, etc. So people are using nicotine as a solution, and all of our campaigns were about nicotine as a problem. And so a lot of people probably responded, "You just don't get my life. So I'm not going to pay any attention." And I was at this conference at one time on how we communicate about smoking, and folks were saying, well, the problem is we don't have a language of poverty. And amazing person who's a specialist in poverty walked up to the mic. She was a speaker that day, so she could get away with this, and said, "I want us to stop just for a moment. This isn't about poverty. This is about toxic stress." Both, and this particular person was raised in a very impoverished environment and had a lot of stress, although it wasn't, I don't think it was maltreatment stress, but a lot of stress during childhood that would have flooded the body with cortisol and neurotransmitters that are associated with stress. And she said, "Both of my brothers are in prison, both of my brothers smoke. And until you have an alternative to smoking that works as well as nicotine, you have no business telling them they can't smoke. They have to use something to help them feel like they can live this life." And so therein lies one of the big challenges of our generation, of us as leaders, is to find accommodations to these normal responses to stress, to find accommodations that are not as deadly as nicotine, right? Because there are other solutions that help with anxiety and focus and depression, etc. And so that's what we need to really focus on is we understand that some kinds of risk behaviors are people trying to solve these difficult challenges of how they biologically respond to stress in their lives. So you can see in the second chart, these are people from the original Kaiser Permanente study who said they'd ever had a drug problem. And they had, I should say, in the Kaiser Permanente study, folks answered a very long survey that included a whole health history, a family health history, and included their childhood experience of adversity. And then they gave permission to the researchers to have access to their medical records for the rest of their lives. So we continue to see articles published from the ACE study as that group of people, 17,000 people, ages. And so they had not only their self-report of a drug problem, but they also had their full medical record so they could verify that kind of problem. And you see that dose-response relationship across the bottom of the ACE scores. The higher the ACE score, the higher the percentage of population that's had a drug problem in their lives. And that, especially IV drug use, has, ACEs are driving the lion's share of IV drug use. In fact, Dr. Anda, who actually crunched the original numbers for the study, said that he had to, in order to make bar charts like that, he had to plug a number in at the 0 ACEs, because really almost no one with 0 ACEs had ever taken a needle and shot up. It's so related to the level of adversity in childhood. So a big part of chronic disease is driven by adverse childhood experience. You can see this chart on cardiovascular disease, not quite as neat, but still a doubling of the risk from 0 ACEs to the high ACE score. And asthma, a very strong dose-response relationship. And I could show you charts for all of these chronic diseases. Now we have not only the original ACE study, but we have the state's data, very, very clear patterns in every single state that match the original study. And ACEs are driving a very large proportion of mental illness, from anxiety to depression. And we have here, you can see the dose-response relationship with anxiety, but also on getting treatment for a mental health condition. So that means a third party has agreed that there is a mental health condition that warrants treatment. So we can see from self-report, and we can also see from the levels of medication usage, that ACEs are driving our mental health challenges. And ACEs are also driving a lot of work-related challenges. Worker injury, absentee from work, their financial problems, which make it difficult for people to focus at work, and on and on and on. So adverse childhood experience, the ACE score is highly predictive of the rates of problems in the population, health, behavior, social problems in the population. And I've showed you how ACEs lead to singles of those problems, but ACEs are also highly predictive of co-occurring problems in the population. And this is a slide that I'm using with permission from Rob Anda, and he developed this during the original study, where what he did was, you see ACE score along the bottom, but the vertical axis is the number of co-occurring conditions that people in the original study had. And what he did was he said, well, I'm going to make a list of the kinds of challenges that represent different body systems, and then I'm going to see whether ACEs are related to having problems in these different body systems, because life would be a lot harder if that were true, and we should be listening and watching for that. And what he found was, indeed, people with ACE scores of 0 had about 1 or 1.5 of these kinds of conditions. But people with ACE scores, with high ACE scores, had on average 4.5 of those at any given time. So life feels harder because life is harder. People are juggling many more kinds of challenges in their lives, and it makes it more difficult to parent and to follow through on everything that society asks of us. So recently, we co-produced with Dr. Chris Blodgett. Chris is a researcher at Washington State University who's a specialist in human attachment and who works with the National Child Traumatic Stress centers across the nation. Amazing researcher. And our legislators began to ask, well, if ACEs are driving physical health and mental health, ACEs are driving social problems, what's the relationship between ACEs and academic problems, like passing the high-stakes tests that we have in place in our state? And so Dr. Blodgett and I partnered on this study with the nonprofit that I work for part-time, the Foundation for Healthy Generations. And we took a look at how ACEs are related to academic success. And we found that as children's ACE scores go up, child test scores go down. But also risk behaviors are increased. And the kinds of social supports you need to be able to develop in order to have the habits of having a social network, those social supports and skills also go down. So kids are less successful academically, they have higher risk behaviors, and they have a less strong social network to help them journey into adult life. Chris says that while poverty continues to be a very strong influence on youth well-being, community and youth ACE scores, and I'm going to talk about community ACE scores in a few minutes, but community and youth ACE scores are more consistent predictor of youth well-being than poverty. So in Oregon, I took a look at your adult ACE prevalence. Along the bottom, on the left-hand side, we see ACE scores of 0 and 1. In the center, ACE scores of 2 to 3. And on the right, ACE scores of 4 or more. The darkest, I think they're navy bars, are adults in Oregon. And the orange bars are youth in care. So we see we have a complete reversal of the childhood experience of adults versus youth in care, where we see the highest percentage of people in care having 4 or more ACEs. Now this is interesting to me because you could have an ACE score of 1 and still be in care, right? Because care is determined mostly by severity and frequency and not necessarily by the pileup of different kinds of adversity in a child's life. What this tells me is that we as a society, I'm not having any criticism of child welfare, my heroes, amazing system, but we as a society are turning our backs. As kids are experiencing one kind and then another kind and then another kind, we probably can't see the first ACE in a family, right? We're not inside that home. But I would submit to you that the adults around that family and around that child certainly can tell when the ACE score is going from 3 to 5 to 7 to 10. And we don't have systems in place yet to notice the accumulation of different kinds of adversity that are happening in children's lives as they're growing up. And therein lies a second kind of challenge for us as a generation. We get to build those systems that can notice differently about the accumulation of different kinds of adversity. So ACEs are considered to be the most powerful determinant of health that's known today. They're thought of that way because of the breadth of the number of kinds of problems that ACEs are driving in society. And you can see here a list. I think there's a list in the handout I gave you. But they range from risks to chronic illness, mental health, health and social problems, including 61% of adult incarceration in Washington is attributable to ACEs, according to our most recent calculations. Over 60% of having been homeless as an adult is attributable to ACEs. Social problems driven by ACEs in our society, all the way to intergenerational transmission of ACEs is occurring largely because of the ACEs that the parent generation experienced. The second reason that ACEs are considered to be the most powerful determinant of health is that they're driving such a big portion of each of these problems. So what I've done here for this slide is I've taken a sampling of different challenges that occur in people's lives. And in the center, we made this slide actually right after the Gulf oil slick. So this slide was inspired by the idea of an oil spill. And in the center, the dark gray portion is the portion of each of these problems that's attributable to adverse childhood experience. And it's huge. It's, so if we look at alcohol and binge drinking, 32, almost 33% of binge drinking is attributable, 36% of tobacco use, 1 in 5 cases of asthma, and you can read around the wheel. Between 20 and 80% of all of the major health and many of the major social problems are attributable to ACEs. So ACEs are powerful because they're driving so many different problems, but also because they're driving so much, such a large percentage of the problem in the population. And what's great about that is what's predictable is preventable. We now understand how life experience affects growth and development. We now understand more about the escalation of problems in people's lives. And as we are successful driving down the ACE scores for the next generation, preventing the accumulation of high ACE scores, it's like putting a sponge in the middle of that oil spill. We reduce all of these problems at once. We don't have to have completely separate efforts on this problem and this problem and this problem. Our weaving of this NEAR and ACE science through our work can reduce all of these problems concurrently. It's the most powerful opportunity of our time, maybe of all time, because these positive effects are bigger, I would argue, than just the effect of understanding the importance of clean water. So parenting adults, we're going to move to what do we do about it? Parenting adults have the most power for preventing ACEs. Nobody else is going to come anywhere as close. So whether it's a birth parent, a kinship kind of person who's raising a child and parenting in that role, or a foster parent, parenting adults are having the most power for preventing ACEs. But parenting can be a lot harder for adults who had a high ACE score. Having difficulty with emotional regulation, having small amounts of stress feel like a large crisis, having difficulty with memory, transitions, etc. These things make it very hard to parent. So a little bit of support goes a long ways, but it needs to be the right kind of support. And we understand also that populations that have experienced historic trauma are more at risk for experiencing adverse childhood experiences. We understand that if you experience ACEs, you're more at risk for experiencing peer adversity as you're growing up, and you're more at risk for adult adversity. So there's a progressive nature to adversity, and the good news about that is we can have strong preventive actions all the way along the life course if we understand how adversity escalates over time. We wanted to know in our office something that I think is really critical. And let me tell you a little bit about why I think it's critical. Yes, please. Cross-cultural. We have. The telephone survey doesn't tell us a lot about culture. It tells us about race, ethnicity. And so we need to do more qualitative study to really understand culture, which is a pretty important dynamic. But we do see higher adverse childhood experience prevalence among populations that have experienced historic trauma. So immigrants that experience historic trauma where they came from, or African Americans with a history of slavery, Native Americans obviously with a history of colonization and systematic assault from the federal government. We do see higher ACE scores. Interestingly enough, we see lower intergenerational transmission of ACEs among Hispanic immigrants. And so we think there's probably some cultural norms around children and extended family reciprocity that would come to bear on that. Good question. Anybody else right now? No? So, yes. She has a whole page of questions. I love it. I haven't seen that study yet. So it might be out there, but I haven't seen it. It's a really great question. And given that ACEs drive such a large percentage of mental health challenges, my guess is that ACE scores are very, very high. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
I'm out for a minute, so forgive me if somebody else asks.
That's okay.
diagnosed for having those experiences? Is it just through observing current behavior, or are there any kinds of scientific examinations, brain studies, or anything?
Well, there are a number of screening tools that are, for a child that under the age of 5, for a very young child who maybe can't report what has happened in their lives accurately or maybe is pre-verbal, she's asking, how do we diagnose, how do we know? And there are a number of really good screening tools. I don't know them off the top of my head because I'm not a clinician, but there are good screening tools for very young children. Children's behavior often is a clue. Children often speak through their behavior, but not every child with a behavioral disorder has a high ACE score either, so you can't necessarily assume that. I think the adults around the child often do know, and that's what Dr. Chris Blodgett has done extensive work trying to look at the question of, in early Head Start and Head Start and in K-12, can we use what we already know about children's lives, what the adults in the system already know about children's lives, to approximate as proxy for an ACE score? And he's estimated that about 12% of elementary age kids have an ACE score of 3 or more. And he's not asking the parent, he's not asking the child, he's using what the adults around that family know about the child and the family. I think a lot of times the people in the circle around a family actually do know, they just don't know what to do. And so they're concerned that the only thing they know how to do could get a child taken away from the family, and we're not that well skilled. As a society, this science is new, so we still haven't developed all of the repertoire we need in order to really effectively work with a mom or a dad that's having difficulty with emotional regulation, with attention, who doesn't know that it's not the child that needs the timeout, it might be the adult that needs a break to take a walk. And so we're still developing those skills. The other complication that comes up for children is this notion of delay that Martin Teicher talks about. The hippocampus, which is sensitive in the very earliest period of life, has those baby or granule cells that are pre-programmed to blossom around puberty. So there's a 9 to 13 year delay before we actually see the full effects of toxic stress in very early childhood. And that means that even though a child, we might know a child, in fact, who had really horrific kinds of experiences in the first 2 or 3 years of her life, and in 3rd grade all the adults are saying, she's doing fine, she's fine. And I would encourage us to keep on watching for the kinds of ways we can support her, because we may not have fully seen the effects of that toxic stress until that child gets to the puberty years and that portions of the brain fail to do the major blossoming. Now there are accommodations that can really help, and I'm going to talk about those in a few minutes. But we can't necessarily take current time as the whole story for whether that child has been affected by toxic stress. I guess that's the punchline there. So I live in the county in Washington State with the highest ACE prevalence. Of course, I didn't know that when I started learning about ACEs, but I have been an elected official in the county where I live, and I had known how volatile our citizenry was. And I had been in the role of advocating for my neighbors and my friends and the voters in my county, and going to the state and saying, no, the services you're providing aren't helping, we need to change them, and just hitting a brick wall over and over and over. And the answer I would get as an elected official from my state officials was, the people in your county are hard to serve. That's what the problem is. The problem isn't our service, it's that you're hard to serve. And that bothered me, as you can imagine, because I love the people in my county. They're awesome. And many of them have gone through some really tough stuff in their lives. So when we started unfolding this data, I started asking the question, well, if the accumulation of adversity in childhood matters that much, then what happens if you have the accumulation in childhood and then you also get an accumulation in adulthood? Because we see this risk for that progression of adversity in the data. And so we made some analysis, and what we discovered is really astounding. We used, along the bottom, you see the number of major adult stressors, and you see that list at the left. So we used homelessness, incarceration, chronic illness, separation or divorce, severe depression, and that was based on the Kessler score of symptoms, and then worker injury. Yes?
Yeah, this left side of the graph shows interrupted days per month.
Yes.
Should that be in a month, or are they losing
In a month.
all of them every month?
We don't know whether it's every month. It was in the month preceding the survey. So this is a telephone survey of adults, and we're asking how many days out of the last month could you not do your usual activities due to some kind of disabling or challenging thing in your life. So, but I think the ACE and our analysis would say that they would be having a hard time functioning every month because they're navigating 3, 4, 5 different kinds of chronic problems in their lives, including social problems, economic problems, health problems, etc. So what this chart does is everybody represented by this bar graph has at least 3 ACEs, so adversity during childhood, plus on the left-hand side they have 3 ACEs plus 0 of these adult adversities, and about 4 or 5% of the population who had 0 or 1 adult adversities piled onto their ACEs had difficulty functioning in their month. But when we get to 3 or more ACEs plus 2, it jumps to 17.5% of that population. And when we get to 3 or more ACEs plus 3 major adult adversities, 57% of the population has difficulty functioning in their own lives. So if they're not showing up for visitation, they're not showing up for appointments, they're not following through on plans, it could be because they're not showing up in their own lives. They're not able to navigate their own lives. And this doesn't work for visitation, but I want to tell you a story of how this finding was used in a health department. So we had a health department director who said, okay, we have really high ACE scores in our county. We have the highest teen pregnancy rate in the state. And we have one of the lowest WIC enrollment rates. So WIC is the Women, Infant, Children Nutrition Program, amazing, awesome program. And in their county, it was an appointment-based program. So she said, what if we decided we didn't need appointments for WIC? What if we said WIC is going to be drop-in, and you're welcome anytime, and we're going to have drop-in on the same day as the food banks open every week, and we're going to let everyone know, and we're going to make 2 rooms, one that has a nurse, who happened to be also a home visitor, who's going to play with children, and we have a mom's room where a mom can get nutrition and talk to people, etc. And their WIC enrollment tripled when they shifted to drop-in. And WIC is funded through enrollment, so their revenue tripled when they changed to drop-in. But the most amazing thing was moms came and stayed all day. And the social network for those moms strengthened tremendously. And who was in the room with those moms and those kids were highly skilled home visiting nurses. So they got the chance to really be together in an environment where they learned together about how to support each other, and they learned together about nurturing behavior, and they also went home with WIC vouchers so they could get better nutrition. A simple change that made a profound difference in their county. And that change, along with other changes over the last decade, has significantly reduced teen birth to teen moms, in part because those moms didn't have a second child. Right? They had the kind of network of support that they needed to prevent that. So just quickly, in Washington, which is probably very similar to Oregon, about 12% of elementary kids we estimate to have an ACE score of 3 or more. It's the highest predictor for health and attendance and behavior, the second highest predictor for academics after special ed involvement. By high school, we can approximate high schoolers' ACE scores through 2 questions in the youth survey. So we don't have all 10 ACEs in the youth survey. Yes?
So is there a direct correlation between special ed? We have weighted school cohort here, and 11% is about, I think, is the maximum experience that's allowed.
Oh, interesting.
Is there a direct correlation?
is there a direct correlation between ACEs and special ed? And you have a cap on how many kids can go into special ed, so the picture might look different in Oregon. We don't have a cap, so yes, the picture might look different in Oregon. Kids with severe health challenges, it might be attributable to ACEs, and kids with behavior challenges are much more likely to be referred to special ed. So we do see higher ACE scores, but there are many reasons that kids would be referred to special ed that don't have to do with ACEs. So it's a mixed bag, but we do see a higher prevalence in that population. So in Washington adults, the same as Oregon, 28% of Washington adults have 3 or more ACEs. In our high schoolers, 42% have 3 or more ACEs. Adults, 28% among our high schoolers, they will be our next parents. They have a much bigger ACE burden. And this is an approximation. We could be off a few percentage points because we're approximating based on 2 ACE questions instead of all 10. But we're not off by very much. The next generation, when you hear teachers say, our classrooms are really different now, it's because their classrooms are really different now. When you hear kids say, you guys don't get our lives at all, it's probably because we don't get their lives at all. And we don't really have very many places in our society, in the society norms, to really listen to what's happening in people's lives, what is their experience. If, in fact, these approximations are accurate, we're looking at this next generation of adults coming into parenting with some real challenges that directly relate to how hard parenting may be for them and how important it will be for us to set up peer systems and support systems and neighborhood systems to help them. We looked at ACEs in juvenile court and adjudicated kids, and of course they have much higher ACE scores. We would predict that. But I think the most important finding that we had was among kids with 5 or more ACEs, among the adjudicated kids, they started being suspended or expelled from school in 2nd grade. So if you're not safe at home and you're kicked out of school, we don't have a lot of other infrastructure in our society for kids. And so we're seeing schools respond to this data by saying, well, maybe we need in-school suspension. Maybe we need some other kinds of infrastructure around these kids, because there has to be some place where we belong. Human beings have to belong, right? It's an essential need that we have, yes.
Not that there's anything we can do to prevent this, nor do I want to, but the whole social media.
Yes, the social media. I think that's a really good point. The social media is a connection, but it's not a human connection, meaning it's not somebody who physically shows up in your life to support you or help you. And it's also not, because there's not a person showing up physically, it's not someone that you can model after their regulation skills. You can't pattern your breathing very easily after somebody that you're typing at, right? So there are some... You know, I used to answer that question differently than I do now. I was at an international conference, and we were presenting papers on belonging, and one of the people is a specialist in gaming. And he works on these games where they're social games, and there's people all over the world that are part of teams, and they're team playing, and you should have seen the pushback. Everybody in the room was like, what you're doing is not about belonging. Well, you know, they were really angry. But after I got to know this researcher, he had grown up in a communist country under really, really frightening circumstances. And he was sharing with me over a meal when we were outside of the, you know, onslaught of criticism of him that for some people where interaction is actually pretty high stress and pretty frightening, that one way to learn to build a circle of supports is through the e-world. And that he does actually know everybody on his team. He's flown to their weddings. There is more of a connection than I had understood. So talking with him, I realized it's probably a more complex picture, but I would agree with you that there are certain aspects of support and help that can't be given online and are important for people to function. Yes?
Yeah. Do any studies that you know of deal with the issue of homeschooling?
Homeschooling. I haven't read studies of homeschooling specifically about ACEs or the neuroscience. And I think the homeschooling world is varied. So there's homeschooling that's used to kind of hide some of these problems. And then there's homeschooling that's used because of people's values or the importance of educating their kids in a particular way, where the family's like Ariana's family, right? And so my guess is those studies, we'd have to tease apart some of the circumstance.
But you don't keep track of, when you look at students, whether they're homeschooled or public?
We don't, but I'm glad you asked that question, because I'm going to put it onto my list for, we're gathering questions that we should ask in the future, and we couldn't survey kids that are currently being homeschooled, but we could survey adults, were they homeschooled, and start to see some of that. So thank you for that. We can consider that in the future. So ACEs are driving all these adult adversities, which I've covered, but you might recognize these top 5, because those are the household dysfunction ACEs that were part of the original ACE study. And we added questions to our household survey of adults so we could look at intergenerational transmission of these household functioning ACEs. Now, it used to be we thought that if one was physically abused, one would be more likely to physically abuse a child, but research isn't bearing that out. Instead, what we see is people that experience a lot of adversity have challenges that result in a wide variety of kinds of problems in their lives. And some of them are just normal responses to toxic stress during development. Things like having a mental illness that is difficult to manage is actually a normal response to toxic stress, especially during sensitive developmental periods when the vermis is being developed. So, for example, a child might have a parent and grow up with a parent with a mental illness. That's not a choice, that's not a behavior, that's a physiological response to the stress in that parent's life. But nevertheless, these challenges in adults' lives become ACEs for the next generation. And we can see that parents with high ACE scores are 14 times more likely to be passing 2 or more of these household functioning ACEs on to their children, unless we put some supports and preventive kinds of systems in place. So I think the highest leverage work we can do is to promote this virtuous cycle of health. We can support parents in ways that help them function better. They have high ACEs, but they're doing better in their lives in ways that help them prevent ACEs in the next generation, and that will reduce ACE scores among children. The great thing about this is if, as we're successful with this, we have lower ACE scores in children, we'll have less ACE effects in the next generation of adults. Lower ACE scores, less ACE effects. And we get the kind of sustainability that we just dream about in the human services. Sustainability that's born from actually solving the problem. Yes?
Does this have an effect in the present?
It does have an effect in the present.
Kids with high ACE scores could be irritating to the parents who are not able to handle it because of their high ACE scores.
Yes, he's referencing what systems thinking people would say is a vicious cycle. So the parents maybe have high ACE scores and they've adapted to those by having difficulty with their regulation and attention and other kinds of factors. And then their kids already have high ACEs, and so they're having difficulty with their behavior and attention and regulation, and so they spark each other. And unless that family develops some skills for how you take breaks, and those breaks have to have certain qualities, it can create this vicious cycle where things escalate very rapidly.
When you do this moderating the ACE effects, does it have a non-vicious cycle?
Yes.
The opposite effect.
If you can moderate the ACE effects among the adults so that they're less triggered in their environment, they are more able to manage their children's emotional regulation and behavior, et cetera. So yes, it has a positive reverses. So here we take a trauma-informed approach. We know the prevalence, we pay attention, we ask, we listen, we affirm, right? We're taking an approach of assuming that there's a lot of this stuff in our systems and we need to appreciate its effect. The core principles of trauma-informed care we can apply: the safety, trustworthiness, which the placement changes we were hearing about really interrupt trustworthiness of the system and of the adults in a child's life. Choice, collaboration, and empowerment. I'm not going to take a lot of time on this, but Trauma-Informed Oregon, a huge wave of work is transforming, as at the beginning, I would say, of helping to transform systems to really embed these principles into those systems. And I think we're going to see some big change in Oregon, maybe even faster than any other state in the country, because I see you just holding on to these principles in a really deep and meaningful way. So the resilience literature would suggest that we need to promote 3 systems in order to have more resilience among this population that's experienced a lot of adversity. We need to improve the sphere that's larger than self, our community, culture, spirituality. We need to improve attachment and belonging in people's lives. And we need to improve individuals' capabilities and the capabilities of groups. And our public investments are almost entirely focused on capabilities, and the problem with that is that capabilities are the thing most interrupted by toxic stress. So we might do better to balance our investments and have some more investments in belonging and community. So one of the challenges that people have is that they have a response to stress that seems quite large. If they've experienced a lot of toxic stress. So a small amount of stress can feel like a huge crisis. So we're seeing systems change to allow for agreements to come about in a social network or among professionals and clients, so that we understand that when someone reports a small amount of stress, we pay attention, because to them it might be a huge crisis in their lives. And just that small change is changing the quality of services and people staying with services longer, because they feel like folks are getting them, that these stresses that they're experiencing are really large in their lives. But researchers, including Katie McLaughlin from the University of Washington now, she says the most important thing when we're thinking about resilience is people have to be safe first. We cannot expect people to self-regulate and learn things like mindfulness or learn how to self-regulate through games and other critical tools until they're safe first. And that's the importance of your work, so thank you so much for doing it. So these are some of the things that help people self-regulate: biofeedback, massage, mindfulness, reflection, movement, music, practicing connection with other people, so peer systems are very important. Cognitive reappraisal training, like trauma-focused CBT, is found to have significant positive effects on kids that have experienced abuse and witnessed domestic violence. In one high school, they used this particular science to change the way they worked with emotional regulation outbursts in their classrooms and in their halls. They taught every single adult how to use this simple target image. And this image was all over the walls in the hallways and all the rooms, in the buses, everywhere. And it's an alternative high school named Lincoln High School in Walla Walla. Some of you may have heard about Lincoln, and you probably will in the next year, because there's a major documentary film coming out about Lincoln. And one of the changes that they made there is they said, gee, if people can't, people who've experienced a lot of toxic stress can't be in a highly emotional state at the same time they're having a rational discussion. They need a break between high emotion and rational discussion, and that break is really important, and it could be physical activity or other kinds of ways to re-regulate before you have to talk about whatever just happened. So they realize we're having our discipline conversations at the wrong time. Here there's this big outburst, and we want to talk about it right then, right when the kid can't. And actually, to tell you the truth, sometimes the adults are pretty up there in their emotional response, and they're probably not able to have that rational conversation there either. So what they did was they had all the adults were trained that if there was an outburst, the adult would invite the kid to come with them over to the target. The adult would go first, and they would say, I'm in the yellow. I can't talk about this right now, but I might be able to later today. Or I'm in the red, it's going to be a day before I'm going to be able to talk to you about this. Then it's the kid's turn, and the kid reflects on his or her emotional state, and through that conversation they decide when the discussion will happen about consequences. There always are consequences. That kid may go to in-school suspension until the time comes to have a discussion about what the consequences should be. But the kid isn't expected to have a conversation when they physiologically can't have it. And just this simple change in when consequences are determined, reduced out-of-school suspension and discipline kinds of challenges at school by 85% in the first year. A part of it is when the conversation occurs, and part of it was that when we reflect on our own emotional state, it lights up a different part of the brain and actually helps us re-regulate. And so the act of having this conversation around the target actually built some new skills among the kids to be able to reflect on their emotional state and say some words out loud about it. So I'm not going to talk too much about executive function because I don't have very many minutes left. I just want to mention that executive function, our ability to have a goal and take directed action toward it, requires a whole complex array of different skills and competencies. You see some of them here on this slide. And executive function continues to develop up through the 20s and maybe even into the 30s, where we can continue to build these strengths. So we should be attending to where are we placing opportunities for people to improve their working memory, their response inhibition, their time management, etc., because it makes a huge difference. I'm going to skip that and go to some of the what is helping information. So parenting education, improving adult skills, very powerful, especially in situations of neglect, where kids have experienced neglect. Increasing the consistency and predictability of the environment makes a big difference for kids that have experienced neglect to then grow and have more brain connections created during the next sensitive developmental period that they go through. Consistent reinforcement, obviously, and building executive functions. And then games. So games and play are a whole new frontier, and neuroscientists are partnering with gaming people to develop online games that are specifically for helping build certain executive functions. So we're at the beginning of a whole new frontier of using games to help kids, and of course it's an environment they love. So if we're trying to improve working memory, if we're trying to improve speed of processing, reasoning, the right fit of a game to a kid might be really productive in their lives. So attachment and belonging. So important, and I think the critical thing I want to leave with you about attachment and belonging is that everybody knows that if you have at least one person who really cares about you with unconditional love, it makes a big difference. But the literature says caring and competent. And this research should make us really look closer at what are the competencies we need to build now that we really understand how people have adapted. And that's a big challenge that we have coming forward, is that we're still learning what are the competencies that we all need. So for belonging and support, ceremonies, rituals, the rhythm and timing of when these happen in people's lives really matter. Art, movement, music, these are ancient ways of creating belonging, and they really work. I'm going to flash forward because I want to end. Sorry. Hey, I can't flash forward. Okay. So in those last couple of minutes, I'm going to show you Help That Helps, and I'll find you and show you those other slides another time in our lives. So because I want to leave you on this high note of we're beginning to be able to see from the data very clearly some things that really matter for parenting age adults. So the kinds of things we're seeing in the data is feeling socially, emotionally supported and hopeful, very powerful, and having at least 2 or more people that will show up physically in your life and help you, very powerful. So let's look at emotional support. This is smoking. You see the dose-response relationship to ACEs. This is set up the same way. This is percentage of people smoking with low social emotional support in their lives. And this is the percentage with high social. See the drop in the percentage in the population that's smoking. All these are set up the same way, so I'll move quickly through them. This is sleep. with social emotional support. Poor mental health with social emotional support. Look at the huge drop in the population with poor mental health when they have social emotional support. Poor physical health, an ability to work. This isn't unemployed, this is the people who say they can't work. This huge drop in the proportion of people who say that. And having 2 or more people that show up in your life and help is absolutely vital. It's vital for the parenting generation, and it's vital for the kids as well. So this is ACEs and hunger. This is, you see this big drop? That shouldn't surprise us, right? If people will show up, they might bring food. So that didn't surprise me. But what about diabetes? I didn't think I'd see that. Or depression. Look at that huge drop in depression when people will show up. Mental illness symptoms using the Kessler scale. So people might still have a mental illness diagnosis, but they don't have the high symptoms that they're dealing with. Poor health. And then community. In community, reciprocity, our interactions with one another. Do we do favors for each other? Do we look out for kids? Can we count on other adults to intervene if kids are in trouble? Those kind of dynamics in a community are important. And social bridging. Social bridging is, I imagine my own circle. How common is it to reach outside of that circle to bring help in for one of us? Social bridging, a really important part of social capital. I don't have charts and graphs, but I can tell you just from looking at the initial data that we have that in communities with higher scores on reciprocity and bridging, we see lower rates of obesity, mental illness symptoms, alcohol consumption among parenting-age women, and on and on and on. And what's important about this list is its health and its health behavior. So when we are able to layer these resilience factors for individuals and then resilience factors for the community, we get improvements in health status and health behavior that will in turn improve health status even more. So in closing, I want to take us back to Ariana, because she's really what we're all about, right? We're all about flourishing. So we're at the end of our visit in southern Italy, and we're sitting at the table, and all of a sudden, on the last night we were there, all of a sudden, all of the Italians stop translating for us, and they're all talking in Italian, and they're talking with their hands like this, and they're all talking at once, and clearly there's several arguments happening at once, and everyone in the room is tracking all the arguments. They don't wait for one person to talk. It's all talking at once, and they're excited, and they're agitated. We have no idea what they're saying. And little Ariana sits in her chair, and she starts going like this, and then she goes up, dap, 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 with her little hands all around, bop, dap, mop, dap, and one of the uncles jumps her out of her chair and plops her down and says, "Everybody, Ariana has something to say." And Ariana says, "Ah, dap, dap, mamma mia." If we think we're not creating culture every moment, that we don't have an opportunity to shift the culture today that will make a safe place for our children and our grandchildren, we should think again. Because we can't all be Italian, but we can all be flourishing. Thank you.